August 20th, 1945. The humid air of Yokosuka Naval Base hung thick with the smell of salt water and burned metal. Lieutenant Michiko Yamada stood at rigid attention in a concrete administrative building that still bore scorch marks from American bombing raids. Her crisp Imperial Japanese Navy uniform pressed despite everything, despite the surrender, despite the end of the world as she understood it. She was 24 years old and had never spoken to an American in her life. Through the window behind the American naval officer's desk, she could see the twisted wreckage of what had been the pride of the combined fleet. Warships reduced to skeletal remains, jutting from the harbor like the bones of prehistoric creatures. The American captain, a man perhaps 40 years old, with tired eyes and a Missouri accent she couldn't parse, was looking at her with an expression she had no framework to interpret. Then he spoke through his translator, and the words made no sense. "You must be exhausted. Please, sit down. Can we get you some tea?" The politeness was more disorienting than cruelty would have been. She had prepared herself for contempt, for the justified rage of victors whose soldiers and sailors she had helped coordinate strikes against, whose cities she had celebrated seeing burned in newsrooms. She had prepared for execution or imprisonment, for the consequences of having served as a communications officer in a military that had started a war of aggression and lost catastrophically. She had not prepared for tea. She had not prepared for the American officer to pull out a chair for her as if she were a guest rather than a defeated enemy. She had not prepared for kindness, and its presence in that moment felt like a violation of natural law, like watching water flow upward or seeing the sun rise in the west. Women had served in the Imperial Japanese military in limited but significant numbers, particularly in communications, logistics, and administrative roles that freed men for combat duties. By 1945, approximately 30,000 women held official positions in the Japanese armed forces, though millions more had been mobilized for war production and civil defense. These women, particularly those who held officer ranks, were products of an intensive ideological formation that began in girlhood and intensified through years of militaristic education. They had learned that Japan's war was a sacred mission to liberate Asia from Western colonialism, that the emperor was a living deity whose will superseded individual existence, that death in service to the nation was the highest honor, and that surrender was a shame worse than annihilation. They had been taught that Americans were beasts, racial inferiors who lacked the spiritual purity and warrior discipline of the Yamato people, that American men were cowards who relied on material superiority because they lacked Bushido spirit, and that American occupation would bring unspeakable horrors. Lieutenant Yamada had believed these things with the fervor of someone whose entire identity had been constructed around them. Born in 1921 in Hiroshima, she had grown up in an increasingly militarized society where every aspect of civilian life was subordinated to imperial expansion. By the time she was 12, her school curriculum had been reformed to emphasize national spirit over academic content. By 15, she was participating in mandatory military drills and aircraft recognition training. By 18, she had volunteered for the Women's Naval Auxiliary, motivated by a genuine conviction that her service was essential to Japan's divine mission. Her training had been rigorous and unforgiving, designed to transform young women into efficient functionaries of a military machine that valued obedience and self-sacrifice above all else. She had excelled, rising to lieutenant. By now, responsible for coordinating communications between Naval Command and forward positions across the Pacific. She had been good at her job, which meant she had been complicit in operations that killed thousands of Allied personnel. She had transmitted orders for kamikaze strikes, coordinated convoy movements, processed intelligence about American ship positions. She had done these things without hesitation because she believed absolutely in the righteousness of Japan's cause, even as the war turned catastrophically against Japan, even as American submarines strangled supply lines and American bombers reduced cities to ash. The propaganda had insisted that spirit would triumph over material, that the divine wind would protect the homeland, that every Japanese citizen must be prepared to die fighting rather than accept the pollution of surrender. Then came the twin blows of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the incomprehensible weapons that erased cities in an instant, followed by the Emperor's radio address on August 15, 1945, his voice thin and distant and speaking in a formal court Japanese that most ordinary citizens struggled to understand, announcing that Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration terms. Lieutenant Yamada had listened to that broadcast in the underground communications bunker, surrounded by other women officers, and felt something fundamental break inside her consciousness. The Emperor's voice, the first time most Japanese had ever heard it, telling them to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable, meant that everything they had sacrificed for, everyone who had died, all the certainty that had structured existence, was suddenly revealed as insufficient. The divine protection had failed. The inevitable victory had not come. The Americans, whom they had been taught to despise as spiritually inferior, had won absolutely. The days between the surrender announcement and the actual arrival of occupation forces were a strange, suspended time. A collective holding of breath as Japanese military and civilian personnel waited to discover what defeat would actually mean. Rumors circulated with the virulence of plague that American soldiers would rape every woman they encountered, that Japanese men would be executed or enslaved, that the entire population would be subjected to the same treatment Japan had inflicted on conquered territories. These weren't baseless fears, but projections drawn from Japan's own conduct during the war. The military had treated conquered populations with systematic brutality. Japanese propaganda had insisted this was how wars were fought, that the Americans and British had done the same, that the only difference was hypocrisy versus honest acknowledgement of power's reality. If that was true, then Japan's defeat meant reciprocal horror was coming. It didn't come. When the first American occupation personnel arrived at Yokosuka Naval Base on August 30th, 1945, Lieutenant Yamada and her fellow women officers had been assembled to facilitate the transition of communications infrastructure to Allied control. They stood in formation, rigid with terror and determination to die with dignity if execution was to be their fate. Instead, the American officers who entered the building offered handshakes, asked about their roles and responsibilities, inquired whether they needed medical attention or food. The Americans seemed tired and businesslike, interested in establishing functional administrative systems rather than revenge. They issued instructions through translators about how the handover would proceed, what documentation was needed, which facilities required immediate attention. And then, with a casualness that suggested it was unremarkable, they distributed rations to the Japanese personnel who would be working with them. The food was the first crack in the ideological edifice. Japanese military rations by 1945 had diminished to near starvation levels. Rice mixed with inferior grains, occasional dried fish, almost no meat or fat. Civilian populations were surviving on even less, their ration cards providing calories sufficient only to prolong dying. The Americans opened their field rations as if they contained nothing special. Canned meat, crackers, chocolate, instant coffee, cigarettes. They ate their portions and offered the rest to the Japanese personnel without ceremony or condition. Lieutenant Yamada had stared at the tin of Spam placed in her hands, at the packaging with its English text and detailed nutritional information, at the casual abundance it represented, and understood with sudden clarity that Japan had been fighting an enemy whose productive capacity was so vast that even after 3 years of global warfare, it could feed its occupying forces luxury items as routine provisions. The symbolic weight of that Spam tin would stay with her for the rest of her life. It represented more than just food, though the hunger was real and immediate. It represented the comprehensive falseness of everything she'd been told about American weakness and imminent collapse. It represented an industrial and agricultural system so robust that fighting a war on multiple continents hadn't required civilian starvation. It represented the material reality that ideology had obscured, that Japan had challenged a power whose economic foundations were so much stronger that the outcome had never truly been in doubt, that all the talk of spirit triumphing over material had been delusion or deception, that the sacrifices had been for a cause that was doomed from inception. But it was the words, not the food, that proved most devastating to her worldview. In the weeks following the initial surrender, as Japanese personnel worked alongside American occupation forces to restore basic infrastructure and process the dissolution of the imperial military, Lieutenant Yamada found herself in daily contact with American officers who treated her not as a despised enemy, but as a professional colleague whose expertise was needed. They asked her technical questions about communication systems, They solicited her advice on effective ways to communicate with Japanese civilian authorities. They expressed appreciation when she worked long hours to help establish functioning administrative processes. One American major, learning that she had family in Hiroshima, offered his condolences with what seemed like genuine sympathy, then helped her secure travel papers to visit the devastated city to search for relatives. The kindness was systematic and pervasive, not limited to a few exceptional individuals, but apparently embedded in the operational culture of the American military. Japanese women officers who had expected rape or execution instead found themselves addressed with formal courtesy, their technical knowledge respected, their basic needs attended to. American personnel offered them food, medical care, and even cigarettes without demanding anything in return. When Japanese women officers flinched at sudden movements or raised voices, conditioned by years of military discipline that had included physical punishment for minor infractions, American personnel adjusted their behavior, moving more slowly, speaking more quietly, creating environments that felt less threatening. The historical documentation of these encounters exists in scattered memoirs, in occupation force reports, and in oral histories collected decades later from women who served in the Japanese military during the war's final stages. Dr. Huko Taja Cook's research on Japanese women's war experiences includes dozens of interviews with former women officers who described their interactions with American occupation personnel as profound ideological disruptions. One woman recalled an American nurse who bandaged her infected hand and then gave her the remaining gauze and antiseptic to take with her, telling her through a translator to come back if it didn't heal. Another remembered an American officer who learned she had been a literature student before the war and spent an afternoon discussing Japanese poetry with her through laborious translation, treating her aesthetic opinions as worthy of serious consideration. These were small gestures, individually insignificant, but cumulatively they demolished the propaganda framework that had insisted Americans were culturally barbaric and spiritually empty. The contrast between expectation and reality operated at multiple levels. Japanese military culture had been built on hierarchy, so rigid it approached caste. Officers from aristocratic or samurai families treated subordinates with casual cruelty. Women officers, though accorded formal respect due to their ranks, were constantly reminded of their auxiliary status and their fundamental duty to support rather than lead. Physical punishment for errors was routine. The idea that superior officers owed any consideration to subordinates beyond minimal maintenance of their capacity to serve was foreign to the system. American military culture, while certainly hierarchical, operated under different assumptions. Officers were expected to look after their personnel's welfare. Unnecessary cruelty was considered poor leadership. Even in interactions with defeated enemies, there was an assumption of baseline human dignity that didn't require shared nationality or ideology. Lieutenant Yamada began to understand this during a long conversation in September 1945 with an American captain who had been a high school teacher in California before the war. Through the laborious medium of translation, he explained that he didn't hate Japanese people, that he hated the war and the militaristic government that had started it, but that he recognized most Japanese personnel had been trapped by circumstances and propaganda, just as most Americans had been drafted into a war they didn't choose. This distinction between hating a political system and hating the individuals caught in it was conceptually difficult for her to process. In the Japanese ideological framework she'd been raised in, the individual and the nation were not separate. To serve the emperor and the state was to fulfill one's essential nature. The idea that one could oppose a government without despising the people it governed suggested a different relationship between citizen and state, one where political systems were understood as human constructions that could be evaluated and changed rather than eternal truths that defined identity. These conversations, repeated across thousands of interactions between American occupation personnel and Japanese military women began a long process of ideological reconstruction that would reshape post-war Japan. The transformation wasn't immediate or universal. Many Japanese women officers clung to militaristic beliefs, despite evidence, interpreting American kindness as weakness or maintaining that Japan's cause had been righteous even in defeat. Some carried resentment and humiliation for the rest of their lives. Unable to reconcile defeat with the promises of inevitable victory they had sacrificed for, but for significant numbers, particularly younger women whose identities were less rigidly formed, the gap between what they'd been told to expect and what they actually experienced created space for fundamental reconsideration. Lieutenant Yamada kept that spam tin, carefully cleaned and preserved, for decades after the war. It became a private talisman, a physical reminder of the day her understanding of the world shifted. She would later write in a memoir, published in the 1980s, that the tin represented both the abundance of American material culture and the generosity that abundance made possible. We had been taught that Americans were weak because they were wealthy. She wrote that their comfort had made them soft and cowardly. We learned instead that their wealth had given them the confidence to be kind, that they could afford generosity because they were strong enough not to fear the defeated. Our poverty, which we had been told was noble sacrifice, had made us cruel. Their abundance had made them merciful. The kind words American officers offered to Japanese women officers in the aftermath of surrender were more than simple politeness. They were expressions of a different way of organizing society, one built on assumptions about individual worth and human dignity that didn't require ideological conformity or racial hierarchy. Japanese military ideology had demanded total subordination of self to state, had promised glory through collective sacrifice, had insisted that dying for the emperor was the highest achievement. It had delivered instead catastrophic defeat, millions dead, cities incinerated, and the divine emperor reduced to a constitutional figurehead by foreign occupiers. American democratic ideology, which Japanese propaganda had mocked as weak and decadent, had proven militarily superior and more disorienting, had revealed itself capable of restraint and humanity in victory. The women officers of the Imperial Japanese military who encountered American kindness in those final months of 1945 carried forward a knowledge that shaped the reconstruction of Japanese society. Not all of them embraced democracy or abandoned their nationalist sentiments, but they could not return to the simple certainties of imperial ideology because they had experienced its comprehensive failure. They had seen that the enemy they were taught to despise as spiritually inferior was capable of compassion they had never received from their own military hierarchy. They had learned that material abundance and moral decency were not opposites, but could reinforce each other. They had discovered that defeat did not have to mean destruction, that victors could choose mercy, that human society could be organized around principles other than martial domination and racial destiny. 70 years later, research is interviewing the last survivors of Japan's wartime generation found that many women who had served as officers in the imperial military remembered, with precise clarity, their first interactions with American occupation personnel. The moment when kindness replaced expected cruelty and forced a recalibration of everything they thought they understood. An elderly woman in Osaka, once a Navy communications lieutenant, recalled the American major who had helped her search for family after Hiroshima, who had spent hours making telephone calls on her behalf, who had offered her his rations when she hadn't eaten in 2 days, who had treated her not as a defeated enemy but as a human being in crisis, who deserved assistance. He didn't have to do any of that, she said in an interview recorded in 2010, her voice still marked by wonder decades later. We had been at war. His side had won. He could have ignored my suffering or enjoyed it. Instead, he helped, as naturally as if we had always been on the same side. That simple kindness taught me more about the possibility of peace than any treaty could. In the vast historical accounting of World War II's end, these moments occupy little space. They lack the drama of surrender ceremonies or the moral gravity of war crimes tribunals. They're too small, too intimate, too ambiguous in their emotional register to fit the grand narratives of good versus evil, democracy versus fascism. Yet they represent something essential about how ideological transformations actually occur. Not through dramatic conversions, but through the slow accumulation of experiences that contradict what people were told to expect. Through the gap between propaganda and reality, made visible in daily interactions. The American officer who offered Lieutenant Yamada tea in that concrete building on August 20th, 1945, probably never thought about that moment again. He processed hundreds of Japanese personnel in the following months, went home to Missouri when his service ended, and lived the rest of his life doing whatever people do when they survive wars and return to ordinary existence. He didn't know that his courtesy, meaningless to him, would echo through someone else's consciousness for the rest of her life. that it would become the reference point she used to measure the distance between what she'd been promised about the world and what the world actually contained. That's the strange mathematics of human decency across the boundaries of war. Its significance is often invisible to those who extend it and world-changing to those who receive it. By the time Japanese women officers were fully demobilized in the months following surrender, they carried with them not just memories of defeat, but evidence of an alternative way of relating to other human beings. They had experienced a military culture that treated even defeated enemies with baseline respect, that extended small kindnesses without requiring ideological conversion or abject submission, that separated opposition to a political system from hatred of individuals. Not all of them integrated these experiences into new worldviews. Some buried the memories and tried to resurrect the old certainties, but others, particularly those young enough to rebuild their identities from the rubble of imperial ideology, carried forward an understanding that would shape how they raised children, how they participated in post-war society, how they remembered what had been lost and what had been found. The kind words offered by Americans to Japanese women officers in the aftermath of defeat were more devastating to imperial ideology than any bomb, because they revealed that everything the ideology had promised about the spiritual superiority of Japan and the barbarism of the West was simply false. The Americans were not beasts. They were not inferiors. They were not weak. They had won comprehensively and then chosen, with a casualness that suggested it was natural rather than exceptional, to be kind. That keenness extended across the chasm of language and war and ideology, demonstrated a strength that had nothing to do with firepower and everything to do with confidence. The confidence of a society that believed in its own values enough to extend them even to enemies. That was secure enough in its power to be generous. That understood human dignity as something inherent, rather than something earned through ideological purity or racial identity. In the end, it wasn't the military victory alone that transformed Japan from an imperial militaristic state into a pacifist democracy, though the defeat was certainly necessary. It was also these 10,000 small encounters where Americans chose kindness over cruelty, and revealed through that choice what a democratic society actually meant when it claimed to value human dignity. The lesson learned in those moments, when expected hatred was replaced by unexpected decency, outlasted all the propaganda, all the nationalists' mythology, all the promises of divine protection and inevitable victory. What remained was the memory of kind words offered by an enemy who refused to hate, and the slow understanding that perhaps there was a way of organizing human society that didn't require endless sacrifice for abstractions, that could afford to be generous because it was built on foundations solid enough to withstand challenge, that measured strength not by the ability to inflict suffering but by the choice to extend mercy, even when revenge would have been justified. That memory, carried forward by women who had served the emperor and then watched that service revealed as service to a lie, helped build a different Japan from the ruins of the old, one that perhaps understood more clearly than societies that had never tested their ideologies to destruction, that the truest strength is the kind that can afford to be kind.